Boy, you got a mess here.
Yeah.
See if I can push it. You wouldn't think it would be easy to get stuck in a place out like this. But these salt flats are deceptive. They stretch on for miles, flat and firm looking. And yet, one hesitation in the wrong spot, and you can break through this top crust into a bottomless ooze. This is indeed a desert, as anyone can see. And yet when you try to cross it, you find it's a very peculiar kind of desert. As Professor David Miller used to call it, a desert of mud. And so, given the perils of the mountains and the salt deserts, it's not at all surprising that the earliest immigrant wagon roads avoided Utah, even when it meant going several hundred miles out of the way. Those who did come this way came because of ignorance or because of high-pressure salesman tactics by the promoter of an untried shortcut to California. Most were sorry they'd come and glad to be on their way at the first opportunity. So for the 300,000 people who came by wagon to the west between 1840 and 1860, Utah was a place to be avoided. And I think now we understand why. There was one main starting point for overland travel in the early 1840s, whether you were heading to Oregon, California, or New Mexico. This was the little town of Independence, Missouri, the same town which for a brief time, a full decade earlier, had been the Mormon Zion. Here, people with Western fever outfitted for the journey and began to coalesce into immigrant trains. After leaving Independence, travelers to Oregon and California crossed the well-watered northeast corner of Kansas and moved up into Nebraska, where they struck across the broad valley of the Platte, traveling nearly always on the south side of the river. This was their grand highway to the west, well-watered, grassy, and nearly level. It crossed all of Nebraska past important landmarks such as Chimney Rock and Fort Laramie. Its northern fork continued a third of the way across Wyoming. Finally, the North Platte turned south and immigrants were obliged to cross it, striking west along the Sweetwater River. Now they could view the Wind River Mountains. Some stopped to carve their names on Independence Rock or marveled at the sight of water rushing through Devil's Gate. Most expected South Pass to be an awesome mountain gorge. They were surprised and usually delighted to find instead a series of brush-covered hills. When they reached Pacific Springs and saw the waters coursing westward instead of east, they knew they had indeed crossed over the backbone of the continent. The trail was now downhill to the Little Sandy and then the Big Sandy rivers and thence to the Green. Some at that point continued west. Others dropped southward to Fort Bridger, founded by Jim Bridger in 1843 to serve overland traffic. After Fort Bridger, they went northwest to Bear River, stopping at the famous bubbling waters of Soda Springs, and then hurried on. From there, the Oregon-bound veered off to the northwest, continuing from Fort Hall across Idaho to eastern Oregon. If bound for California, they headed southwest from Fort Hall to hit the Humboldt River. The Humboldt took them almost to the Truckee River, though with a bad desert crossing between them. From the Truckee, they climbed one of the passes over the Sierra and down into California. The fraternity of overland immigrants called their journey "Seeing the Elephant," a phrase that aptly captured the awesomeness of the experience. As one 1852 overlander put it, "To enjoy such a trip, a man must be able to endure heat like a salamander, mud and water like a muskrat, dust like a toad, and labor like a jackass. He must cease to think except as to where he may find grass and water and a good camping place. It is a hardship without glory, to be sick without a home, to die and be buried like a dog." There were instances of overland migration in the 1830s, but if we don't count the mountain men who wandered ceaselessly over this terrain, their numbers were very few. Mass migration over these dusty highways did not begin until the 1840s, and the total in any given year was little more than 100 until 1843. In that year, 900 people traveled, to use their phrase, the plains across. One One of the earliest of these overland companies came right near this spot in 1841, picking a trail through land so forbidding that no one would ever follow their exact route again. Their adventure began in the spring of that year when Missourians John Bartleson and John Bidwell gathered together in Independence a company of 69 men, women, and children who were willing to stake their meager fortunes on an enormous journey into the unknown. Bidwell wrote that we knew only that California lay to the west. Well, luckily for them, Thomas Fitzpatrick and a group of mountain men were willing to accompany them as far as Soda Springs and serve as their guides. From there, the trappers and about half the immigrants headed northward to Fort Hall. The rest, 34 in number, including the wife and teenage daughter of one immigrant named Benjamin Kelsey, moved southwest in what seemed the shortest line toward California. After wandering around in these marshes near Corinne, they struck westward over Promontory Summit, the route surveyors would choose for the Transcontinental Railroad almost 3 decades later. From there, they skirted around the desolate western edge of the Great Salt Lake Desert, their wagons miring so badly in the salt flats that 2 were abandoned before they reached these springs at the base of Pilot Peak. They then wandered over Silver Zone Pass to the southwest until they reached Johnson Springs. They'd been hoping all this time to find a major river flowing westward so they could refashion their wagons into rafts and then float to the Pacific. Disappointed in this hope, they loaded what they could onto their animals, gave the rest to a no doubt bewildered Indian, and then headed northwest till they struck the meager Humboldt River. They were to endure further privations crossing the Sierras, but finally at the end of October they stumbled into California's San Joaquin Valley. The Bartleson-Bidwell Company had brought the first white woman and child through the Utah region. No whites before them had driven wagons across the Salt Lake Desert or refreshed themselves at Pilot Peak Springs. But most importantly, they were the first sizable immigrant party to make their way across the continent, from the States to the far west. Theirs was by any measure an epic journey. Even though California immigration would grow to reach 1,500 in 1846, no immigrant trains came through Utah for 5 more years. Another party did, however, though with an entirely different purpose in mind. This was the exploring party of the great path marker, as he's been called, John C. Fremont, on his second Western expedition. It began in May 1843 in St. Louis with the purpose of exploring possible wagon routes to Oregon. But at Soda Springs, Fremont's curiosity about the Great Salt Lake country got the better of him.
The region possessed a strange and extraordinary interest. We were upon the waters of the famous lake, which forms a salient point among the remarkable geographic features of the country, and around which the vague and superstitious accounts of trappers had thrown a delightful obscurity.
He and a party set out south and shortly found themselves bogged down in what is now the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. Disappointed in their efforts to approach the lake from the north, they moved eastward onto higher lands along the edge of the Wasatch Mountain Range. From the top of Little Mountain, west of the Weber River, they finally gained a panoramic view of the lake.
To travelers so long shut among the mountain ranges, a sudden view over the expanse of silent waters had in it something sublime. Several large islands raised their rocky heads out of the waves, but whether or not they were timbered was still left to our imagination as the distance was too great to determine if the dark hues upon them were woodland or naked rock. Then a storm burst down with sudden fury upon the lake and entirely hid the islands from our view.
In the romanticism of Fremont's description, he echoed the landscape painting techniques of his contemporaries Thomas Moran, Albert Bierstadt, and Alfred Lambourne. Eager to explore further, Fremont and his company inflated a primitive boat, much like today's 8-man rubber raft. On the morning of September 9th, 1843, they set out from near the mouth of the Weber to explore the lake. Unfortunately, their raft began to leak. Pumping furiously to keep afloat, they reached the closest island about noon and climbed to its summit. From the peak, they surveyed the lake and prepared the first reasonably accurate rendering of the shape of the lake and the placement of its various islands. Finding neither water nor trees of any kind, they named it Disappointment Island. A later explorer, Captain Howard Stansbury, renamed it Fremont Island in honor of his predecessor's visit. While the survey was taking place, Fremont's mountain man guide, Kit Carson, carved a cross onto an unusual outcropping of rock near the summit. Though this 7-inch petroglyph would not seem to qualify as the large cross Carson described, many are convinced that it is, in fact, the work of the Fremont party. Before leaving the area, Fremont boiled down a sample of water from the lake. He found that 5 gallons would yield, quote, 14 pints of very fine-grained and very white salt, the first attempt to analyze the lake's water. He also took readings, which allowed him to set the lake's elevation very accurately at 4,200 feet above sea level. After this brief exploration, the party made their way to Vancouver. The next May, they crossed back through Utah Valley on their way to St. Louis. Fremont lost no time in arranging his notes and preparing an account of his explorations. The volume, published in Washington in 1845, was widely circulated, especially among those who had an interest in Western settlement. Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders had copies of the journal and studied it carefully, even before leaving Nauvoo. They could hardly have failed to notice Fremont's explanatory note accompanying his maps.
The Great Basin, diameter 11 degrees of latitude, 10 degrees of longitude, elevation above the sea between 4,000 and 5,000 feet, surrounded by lofty mountains. Contents almost unknown, but believed to be filled with rivers and lakes which have no communication with the sea, deserts and oases which have never been explored, and savage tribes which no traveler has seen or described.
Congress apparently determined that these mysteries should be resolved and funded another trip for Fremont, which he undertook immediately. His party entered Utah in the fall of 1845 by way of eastern Colorado. They spent a month exploring Utah Valley and the Great Salt Lake area. They visited and named Antelope Island. Fremont then settled down to the most important of his goals, the scouting of a route to California from the Salt Lake Valley. The biggest problem was that had plagued the Bartleson-Bidwell Company in 1841. What was the best route from the lake to the Humboldt? Fremont and his party moved out to this area on the southwestern edge of the Great Salt Lake and then fixed their sights on a mountaintop a considerable but unknown distance to the northwest. Traveling all that night, they arrived the next afternoon at the base of the mountain. Fremont proceeded to name it Pilot Peak. Having thus made a trail across the Salt Lake Desert, the party moved on west to explore large parts of Nevada. They finally arrived at Sutter's Fort in California in early December. It happened that Lansford W. Hastings, one of the most avid of California boosters, was at the fort that winter as well. He and Fremont had long conversations which were to be of great consequence to several parties traveling westward the next year. By the time of his meeting with Fremont, Hastings had already published this slim volume, An Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In it, Hastings, who had moved to California from Oregon, portrayed his newfound home as a veritable paradise. But he did more than just extol the advantages of California. He offered immigrants advice on how to make their way there. And in his enthusiasm, he suggested that they could greatly shorten the trip by heading directly southwest from Fort Bridger across the Salt Lake Valley, rather than digressing northward along the main immigrant route to Fort Hall. The most direct path, he said, would be to leave the Oregon route about 200 miles east of Fort Hall, thence bearing west-southwest to the Salt Lake, and, in an incredible understatement, thence continuing down to the Bay of San Francisco. He published the recommendation in 1845 without ever having been over the route himself. His conversations with Fremont that winter confirmed his belief that wagon traffic over the trail was possible. He rode east that spring in a personal effort to divert the flow of traffic from the main immigrant road down across the new proposed cutoff. He picked up Fremont's trail across the Salt Desert, followed his mountain men guide Jim climbing up Parley's Canyon, and then headed north to Echo Canyon and then out to Fort Bridger. From here he sent a letter east recommending the route to incoming trains, and then settled down to wait for their arrival. Well, in July, as the approaching immigrant companies approached the fort, Hastings promised personally to guide them over the cutoff, no doubt assuring him that Fremont had gone over it the previous season without any problems. Well, the magic name of John C. Fremont, together with the promise of personal guidance from the author of the best-selling guidebook of the season, was enough to convince a number of companies. Over the next few weeks, at least 4 companies of immigrants pulled away from the main stream of traffic and headed southwest toward Echo Canyon. They were soon to find that Hastings promised much more than the terrain could deliver. He had not yet worked out the best route from Fort Bridger to Echo Canyon, and he began with the assumption that after leaving Echo Canyon, the Weber River Canyon would provide the easiest crossing into the valleys. Prominent in the first group to take the route were a newspaperman, Edwin Bryant, and a traveling companion, William Russell. Altogether, the Bryant-Russell party consisted of only 9 men on horseback. Even without wagons, they found the recommended route harrowing, especially in the lower Weber Canyon, where, as they put it, they were frequently passing under and sometimes scaling immense overhanging masses and projections of rock. They nonetheless made their way successfully out of the canyon near present-day Ogden, then down across the south end of the Great Salt Lake to these springs at Iosepa in Skull Valley. By August 3rd, they were at the north end of the Cedar Mountains, looking across what Hastings had said was a 40-mile desert to Pilot Peak. According to their account, the mountain man assisting Hastings said, "Now, boys, put spurs through your mules and ride like hell." Well, they did that, and though they found the crossing closer to 80 than the 40 miles Hastings had led them to believe, they made it to Pilot Peak and on to California. The next group, led by George W. Harlan and Samuel C. Young, was larger and risked taking 40 wagons down Hastings Cutoff. They followed roughly the same route as the Bryant-Russell party. They lost at least 1 team and wagon at Devil's Gate and Weber Canyon, but emerged intact in the valley below. They had a terrible time crossing the salt flats, losing both wagons and livestock to the desert of mud. Another party of but 4 men, led by Heinrich Lienhardt, was hard on the heels of the Harlan-Young group. The Swiss Immigrant's Journal provides fascinating details of the trip and descriptions of the terrain. By the time the Lienhardt party set out, Hastings had determined the most direct route from Fort Bridger to Echo Canyon, which gave them some advantage over the earlier companies. But the guide still didn't catch them in time to warn them away from the dangerous Weber Canyon. After finally reaching the Humboldt on September 8th, Lienhardt wrote Riley in his journal that the route they had followed should have been called Hastings Long Trip rather than Hastings Cutoff. The last group to follow the ill-advised route that summer was led by George and Jacob Donner and James Reed. Following the now well-marked route into Echo Canyon, they emerged here near Hennifer to find a note prominently stuck in a stick alongside the trail. The note was from Hastings. He advised them against the wagon-smashing Weber Canyon road, suggesting that they stay there until he and Kleiman could show them the route that they had taken earlier that year. They then sent James Reed and 2 companions who found Hastings on the northern edge of the Oquirrh. Hastings hurried back with them far enough to give them a general description of the route he now recommended. They then returned to the main party, now camped 4 precious days near Hennifer. From there, they turned up Main Canyon. They spent 12 days cutting a road along Dixie Hollow and up part of East Canyon Creek until reaching Little Immigration Canyon and a pass to the west over Big Mountain. They then labored up over Little Mountain and down into Emigration Canyon. Even then, their troubles didn't end. They found the mouth of the canyon blocked with seemingly impassable boulders. Rather than clear them out, they spent a full day double-teaming their wagons so they could lift them up and over the top of steep Donner Hill, now itself clogged with staring condominiums. Finally, on August 23rd, they rolled across the Salt Lake Valley and camped near the Jordan River. From Hennifer to the Jordan, their trip had taken 18 days, a delay that would prove more costly than any of them could ever dream. The desert of mud extracted its usual toll of livestock and wagons. After a string of misfortunes, they reached Truckee Lake, now Donner Lake, in late October, about the same time the Bartleson-Bidwell Company had reached that same point in 1841. But there, for the Donners, disaster struck. Early snows trapped them beside the lake, and before help came, 44 of the original 89 persons in the group had died. Theirs is a tragic story of both courage and human frailty pitted against overwhelming natural obstacles. The migration of 1846 thus ended on a tragic note. Hastings' cutoff had been trying to all and disastrous to the Donners. Later on, when the Salt Lake Valley was settled, parts of the cutoff became practical for travelers to both northern and to southern California. Even then, however, the Fort Hall route remained the established and popular way to the coast, for the sufferings of the pioneers of '46 would long be remembered by subsequent travelers. The 1846 immigration of 2,700 to the West Coast doubled the next year, then dropped to about 1,700 in 1848. The gold rush filled the overland trails to 25,000 in 1849 and 50,000 in 1850. But the biggest year on record was 1852, when 60,000 hardy immigrants saw the elephant in their crossing to California and Oregon. The Utah immigration was but a tiny fraction of that great mass movement. One aspect of the 1846 immigration has always intrigued me. Several dozens of immigrants took 80 or more wagons across the Salt Lake Valley that summer. Why did it not occur to one of them to stop and settle down? The Dominguez party had described the parts of the region they saw in glowing terms in 1776. So did a number of the mountain men in the 1820s. John C. Fremont, after his visit in 1843, recommended the region for raising cattle as well as grains, in a book that many of the immigrants of that season carried in their wagons. Why not settle down and leave the harrowing salt flats and the Sierra Passage to someone else? Heinrich Lienhardt, an 1846 immigrant, was rhapsodic in his descriptions of the Salt Lake Valley.
The land extends from the mountain down to the lake in a splendid inclined plane broken only by the fresh water running down from the ever-flowing springs above. The soil is rich, deep black sand composition, doubtless capable of producing good crops. The clear, sky-blue surface of the lake, the warm, sunny air, the nearby high mountains, with the beautiful country at their foot, through which we, on a fine road were passing, made on my spirits an extraordinarily charming impression. The whole day long I felt like singing and whistling.
Yet Lienhardt and company sang and whistled their way right out into the boggy salt flats and on to California. Why did they not stop? There were doubtless many reasons. Their hopes, after all, had long been fixed on California. I don't think they could have stopped without feeling that they hadn't been made of stern enough stuff, that they'd been forced by nature to settle for a lesser prize. Indians seemed a constant threat to any small garrison of white men living so far from others of their kind. There were no markets nearby for whatever they could get this arid soil to yield. But at the bottom of all this, I suspect they were intimidated by the loneliness of the place. This was a sublime landscape, and even cheering after being shut up in the mountains for so long. But here the wind blew incessantly across a broad expanse of water in a valley where not one of civilization's comforts could be seen from horizon to horizon. Only here and there along the streams did an occasional comforting vertical line, a clump of willows or cottonwood, break the awesome stretch of plain and water. In the Willamette Valley, or at Sutter's Fort, there were people and houses, civilization. There a man could put down roots, but not out here, 1,000 miles from the nearest settlement. Lienhart wrote further in his journal that day,
"Had there been a single family of white men to be found living here, I believe that I would have remained. Oh, how unfortunate that this beautiful country was uninhabited."
And so, by the end of 1846, the route to the Great Salt Lake had been laid out, the path marked, the road tried the whole way. And those who risked life and limb to accomplish this Herculean task left it all and struggled across this desert of mud and on to California. The next move would be up to someone else.